Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
She grew up in a family that kept to themselves, away from the outside world. They didn't know much about politics or changes in the government, as those things happened far away. It was like talking about something from history, such as the death of Louis XVI or the landing of Napoleon. Things like customs and fashion change over time, but in her family, they stuck to their usual ways. If something scandalous happened nearby, it would be forgotten by the time it reached their house. The parents might discuss it quietly when they were alone, but they spoke softly because even walls can hear. The dad might say with a lowered voice, "Did you hear about that bad thing in the Rivwell family?" And the mom would reply, "Who would have thought? It's awful." The kids didn't suspect anything. As they grew up, they remained unaware of the real side of life. They didn't know that people often don't say what they really think and don't do what they say. They weren't aware that it's like being in a constant disagreement or, at least, always ready for disagreements with the rest of the world. They didn't know that honest people can be tricked, sincere people can be made fun of, and good people can be mistreated. Some people continue to be honest and loyal until they die, never realizing the truth. Others, who find out the reality but don't fully understand it, make mistakes, get upset, and feel hopeless, thinking they're just toys in a mean game played by fate, circumstances, and very bad people. The Savignals married their daughter Bertha when she was 18. She married a young Parisian named George Baron, who worked with money on the stock exchange. He was good-looking, well-behaved, and seemed like everything she could want. But secretly, in his heart, he looked down on his old-fashioned in-laws. He would talk about them to his close friends as "my dear old fossils." George came from a good family, and Bertha was wealthy. They made their home in Paris. Bertha became one of those people from the provinces who live in Paris. She didn't know much about the big city, its social life, fun things to do, or its customs. She also didn't know about life's dishonesty and secrets. She loved her home and didn't know much beyond her own street. When she went to another part of Paris, it felt like a long, hard journey to an unknown and unexplored city. She would tell her husband in the evening, "I went through the boulevards today." Her husband took her to the theater 2 or 3 times a year. These were memorable events, and they talked about them for a long time afterward. Sometimes, 3 months later, she would suddenly start laughing and say, "Remember that actor who dressed like a general and crowed like a rooster?" Her friends were limited to 2 families related to her own. She called them the Martinets and the Michelins. George lived his life the way he wanted, coming home whenever he pleased, sometimes not until dawn. He said it was because of work, but he didn't explain much about where he had been. He knew that his wife wouldn't suspect anything. She was innocent. But one morning, she got a letter from an unknown person. Bertha was very surprised and confused. She was too simple to understand how bad it was to get a letter with no name on it. The person who wrote it claimed to care about her happiness, hate bad things, and love the truth. The letter said her husband, George, had a sweetheart for 2 years, a young widow named Madame Rossett. They spent all their evenings together. Bertha didn't know how to hide her sadness or spy on her husband. When he came home for lunch, she showed him the letter, cried, and ran to her room. George had time to understand what was happening and plan his response. He knocked on his wife's door. She opened it but couldn't look at him. He smiled, sat down, pulled her onto his lap, and, in a joking tone, said, "My dear child, the truth is I have a friend named Madame Rossett, whom I've known for 10 years. I think highly of her. I also know many other people I've never told you about, as you don't like socializing or meeting new people. But to quickly address these terrible accusations, I want you to get ready after lunch. We'll go together and visit this lady. I'm sure you'll become friends with her too." Bertha hugged her husband warmly. Her curiosity kicked in, and she agreed to visit the unknown widow. Despite feeling a bit jealous, she sensed that knowing about a danger helps you be ready for it. They went to a small, nicely decorated apartment on the fourth floor of a beautiful building. After waiting for 5 minutes in a dimly lit room with many curtains, a door opened, and a very dark, short, slightly plump young woman appeared, looking surprised and smiling. George introduced them. "My wife, Madame Julie Rossett." The young widow was so happy and surprised to meet Bertha. She didn't expect it because she knew Bertha didn't usually meet people. She was thrilled to make Bertha's acquaintance. She liked George a lot. She called him George in a friendly way, so she really wanted to get to know his young wife and be friends with her. Within a month, the two new friends were always together. They met every day, sometimes even twice, and had dinner together every evening, taking turns at each other's homes. George no longer stayed away or talked about urgent work. He loved being at home, he said. After a while, when an apartment in the building where Madame Rossett lived became available, Bertha quickly took it. She wanted to be close to her friend and spend even more time with her. For 2 whole years, their friendship was perfect, without any problems. They were heart and mind friends, completely devoted and tender. Bertha couldn't talk without mentioning Julie's name. To her, Madame Rossett was perfect. Bertha was extremely happy, calm, and content. But then, Madame Rossett got sick. Bertha hardly left her side. She stayed up all night with her, feeling very sad. Even George seemed very upset. One morning, after the doctor visited, he talked to George and Bertha privately. He said that Julie was very sick. After the doctor left, the sad husband and wife sat across from each other and cried. That night, they stayed up with Julie. Bertha kissed her friend gently, while George stood at the end of the bed, looking closely at the sick woman's face. The next day, Julie's condition got worse. Later in the evening, Julie said she felt better and insisted her friends go back home for dinner. At home, they sat in the dining room, feeling sad and hardly eating. The maid gave George a note. After reading it, he turned very pale. He stood up and told Bertha, "Wait for me. I need to leave for a moment. I'll be back in 10 minutes. Don't leave, no matter what." He rushed to his room to get his hat. Anxious, Bertha waited for him. She didn't go back to her friend until he returned. When he didn't come back, Bertha got worried. She thought of checking his room to see if he took his gloves, which would show if he had to go somewhere. In his room, she saw the gloves and a crumpled paper thrown down in haste. She recognized it as the note George received. A strong desire, the first one she ever felt, tempted her to read it and find out why her husband left suddenly. Her conscience said no, but curiosity won. She took the paper, smoothed it out, recognized Julie's shaky handwriting, and read, "Come alone and kiss me, my dear. I am dying." At first, she didn't understand, thinking of Julie's illness. But suddenly she realized the true meaning. This note revealed the terrible truth, the betrayal she had suffered. She understood the years of deceit, how she was their puppet. She remembered them sitting together, reading from the same book, glancing at each other at the end of each page. Her heart, full of anger and suffering, sank into deep despair. Footsteps approached. She ran and locked herself in her room. One day, her husband called her. "Come quickly. Madame Rossett is very sick." Bertha stood at her door, her lips trembling, and replied, "Go to her alone. She doesn't need me." He looked at her confused, lost in grief, and repeated, "Come now. She's very sick. I'm telling you." Bertha said, "You'd prefer it to be me." Finally, he understood and went back alone to the sick woman's bedside. He openly mourned her, not caring about the wife who didn't talk to him anymore, who lived alone, filled with disgust and anger, praying day and night to God. Despite everything, they still lived in the same house, sitting across from each other at the table in silence and despair. With time, his sorrow lessened, but she didn't forgive him. Their life continued, difficult and bitter for both of them. For a whole year, they were like strangers, as if they had never met. Bertha almost lost her mind. Finally, one morning she went out early and returned around 8 o'clock, holding a huge bunch of white roses. She sent a message to her husband that she wanted to talk to him. He came, worried and uneasy. "We're going out together," she said. "Please carry these flowers. They're too heavy for me." A carriage took them to the entrance of the cemetery, where they got out. Then, tears filling her eyes, she said to George, "Take me to her grave." He shook a bit and couldn't grasp her reason, but he guided the way, still holding the flowers. Eventually, he stopped in front of a white stone, pointing to it without saying anything. She took the bunch of flowers from him and, kneeling down, put it on the grave. Then she silently prayed with her heart. Behind her, her husband stood, lost in memories of the past. She stood up and extended her hands to him. "If you want, we can be friends," she said.